Welcome to Spiral We Radio, where we explore the intersections of neurodiversity, education, and human connection. I'm your producer, here to introduce your hosts, Dr. Barry Gelston and Dr. Karen Arnstein. For the past 8 years, Barry and Karen have worked side by side, researching and developing tools to better understand and support neurodiverse people. In this episode, they take you inside the spiral adaptive lens, a way of seeing learners that's rooted in curiosity, open-mindedness, and the belief that everyone's unique way of thinking has value. Let's get started.
I'm Karen Arnstein. I'm here today with Dr. Barry Gelston, and we're going to talk about that spiral adaptive lens, what he had discovered from his research. Hi, Barry.
Karen, it's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. So just as a quick reminder, in episode 1, we were talking about the spiral adaptive model, the spiral model of development as well. So where does the spiral adaptation lens fit in this model? I know we talked about the origin story, how I came up with this in the first place, and where we've gone with it. But can you give our listeners maybe a little bit of background?
So the context here is that we spoke about this in our last discussion about looking for that dependent variable. And we went out to look for what is this appearance of competence and how does appearance of competence actually look in the real world, and struggled with a lot of terms to try to even get to asking the question with what people, teachers, understand that the child, what they're doing with the learner. And what they came back with is explaining how they see the child and how they perceive them, which is really what I was looking for. So the whole part of how this comes together is how does the teacher perceive the learner?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Something we don't typically think about in those terms when we go through our teacher education programs. And just for our listeners out there, both Barry and I are certificated teachers. We've both worked in public schools. We've both worked in like private settings as well, and also tutoring. So, if you've ever looked at a child and you thought, doesn't fit what I was taught to expect in my program, what do I do? In some ways, it sounds like you're already using a version of the spiral adaptive lens. Is that the case, Barry?
Well, I think what actually saying that this is the spiral adaptive lens. So if somebody is empowered to look at a learner with an accurate view within our paradigm, they are using the spiral adaptive lens. And I want to go back a little bit too, because
Sure.
I first started in special education back in the 80s. I had finished my psych degree, and I worked with autistic children at a place called Benhaven School. And back then, autism was really only thought of as kids who had very low IQs or moderate IQs. They could be savants. Savant syndrome was already understood at the time, and it was before people looked at autism as being across the IQ spectrum. And in working there, one of the things I learned, and as looking back on it now, was that there was a different set of expectations that we had for those learners. We had different goals. We had different perspectives. We had our adaptive lens for them. It wasn't universal like what we're talking about with the spiral adaptive lens, but we would look and think of Bobby. His expectation is that he doesn't make eye contact. He has very herky-jerky communication skills. He does a lot of weird physical stimming, much more than you would see in the general population. And so we would look at that and say, oh, well, that's what Bobby does, and just go on from there. And part of the revelation for me in doing my interviews and my research was that, you know what? Gen ed teachers kind of do that too. And when they do it, they hit jackpot. If they don't do it, then they have an issue.
Interesting.
So if I were to go on and explain, the spiral adaptive lens really is that moment when either you do or you do not prepare to make an adaptive connection. So if you're using your spiral adaptive lens and you're seeing the learner as being a part of neurodiverse, cognitively diverse environment and ecosystem, and that the child is unique in their own way, whether they're neurodivergent or just a collection of some traits or just influences of things that have happened to them during the day or at home or in their culture. If you don't have that perspective, you don't have the spiral adaptive lens. And if you don't have the spiral adaptive lens, then what happens is that you do not make an adaptive connection. You make
Mhm.
either a non-adaptive connection or no connection, or even worse, you can make a maladaptive connection.
Wow, this does not sound good. So let me back up just a little bit here. Can the spiral adaptive lens be used, let's say, in the general education setting in a K-12 general education classroom? Could it be used at home? I mean, just, before we sort of dive into this, is this just for teachers?
No, it's for everybody. It's for parents, it's for teachers, it's for business people. Anybody who has to work with or manage or support other people needs to have that spiral adaptive lens so that we see the other person within the context of neurodiversity and their cognitive diversity. And also, when we talk about this, and we'll talk about it more at times, is what is their culture that's impacting? And it's not just, the regular diversity issues, which are very important, but it's also in the classroom. What are the teachers' perspectives that are being taught in the colleges? What is the perspective of the principal and the guidance counselors or the special ed department or the chair of the department that the teacher is in? Is it about the school committee and what the town is demanding, or the state and what they're demanding, the region of the country you're in, or whatever country you're in? All of that impacts how a teacher views the learner. And all of those are valid and can be balanced and weighted. And we have to do it within the context of understanding cognitive and neurodiversity. How does the person think and react differently based on who they are in their neuro uniqueness? I love that term, neuro uniqueness. That's from Dr. Nicole Tetreault.
But this sounds like it's applicable not just for a classroom, but also for the workplace.
Yes. So in the workplace, and I do this in my experience working, for example, in nonprofits. I do a lot of work in nonprofits as leadership. And in doing so, I have to work with people of different types of neurotypes, whether they go beyond threshold to becoming neurodivergent or just a small collection of traits. And in doing so, I need to put on that spiral adaptive lens without a doctorate and just be a good person and be open-minded and just be like, all right, it looks like they're struggling with, or I think this is how they're dealing with something in their lives, or, they seem like the kind of person who doesn't really want to hear me talk for 45 minutes about something. They want me to get it over with in 20 seconds, and I got to respect that. So, and also I've been in sales and business and that too. So I know my experience there is that I could have people clients that I can sit and talk to them for a while. Some people like to get their whole story off their chest. Some people, want to get quick answers and get bullets. And you need to be able to adapt to the other person. And that's really what this adaptation, when we talk about that, it can have really big meaning if we talk about evolutionary theory and ecological systems and all that. But on a very personal level, there's you, there's me, and what do we need to do to communicate with each other? So all of a sudden, in that context, it's pretty standard and straightforward. How do we just, with an open heart, an open mind, be willing to communicate back and forth and take cues from each other for the purpose of solving what needs to be solved, whether it's learning or getting something done at work, or it could be at home, trying to help your child learn to tie their shoelaces or organize for school at the beginning of the day or talk through issues with friends or what to watch on TV.
This sounds like, in so many ways, I've been hearing so many things lately too about how we have more and more people who are struggling to approach others with that openness and that curiosity and being able to relate to people instead of our devices.
Right.
So it sounds like, so let's go back a little bit. So it sounds like you've really built on the work that I developed years ago with the spiral model of development. And in your dissertation work, you found the spiral adaptation lens, which is really, as you've been describing, that initial point of judgment about understanding. It could be a learner, it could be your own child, it could be a subordinate in the workplace, but to
Or even a
really,
boss too, right? We talk
yeah,
about learning
that's
to
true.
manage
That
up,
is true.
right?
Or a boss.
Yeah.
That's true. But about understanding them in a more open, but also an accurate way. So let's talk about the adaptive connection process. So I'd like to talk about that, but also why we even need this in the first place. Like, why does our existing lens and how we see and relate to people fall short? And I know we've talked about this too in terms of, let's say, K-12 school, right? That there's a lot of limitations there as well. But if you could kind of take a moment and talk about why that existing lens fails us or falls short, that'd be great.
Well, it comes back to language and communication. As humans, our superpower over other animals is our incredible development of language. And we can do this. We can make big concepts. We can grunt and deal with tiny concepts or whatever we need to. But the reality is that as we learn to communicate, quite often what I say may not be what you hear, and what you're saying may not be what I hear. And even if we think we're saying the same thing, we could be totally talking about something different. And it's a struggle to learn to read other people. And this is not a
Yeah.
today issue. This is, as far as I know, at least I can go back to my grandparents, talking to people. This is a long time human issue. And learning how to communicate, negotiate with each other, and support each other. And a lot of what we see in education, even though it's starting to slow down, it's still there is a legacy of things that are prescriptive. So one of
Okay.
the conversations that you and I have had over the years has been that in education, the first thing that teachers are learned is that it's all about the planning, planning, and planning. And then you get to classroom management, which is kind of what we're talking about, but that's barely discussed. So it's about planning, planning, planning. You get to the classroom and you bring your plan, then all of a sudden your plan lasts about 20 to 60 seconds until everything
Yeah.
falls apart when it gets to real children. And for some teachers, it lasts longer. But I think in doing that, you have to be really rigid and really structured and really tough, or fully integrate the adaptive connection, right? So that's part of what we are moving from. And we're not saying don't plan because that's silly, because you have to plan, but that your planning needs to be iterative. And even though you have a wonderful lesson plan, today's lesson plan may not be what it will be like when you do it again next year or with the next section or the section after that. I've taught math classes, 4 a day. And by the time I got to the fourth class, I was pretty good at the fourth one where I wasn't so good at the first one in the day. And that's kind of standard. New teachers struggle with that, knowing that you can evolve and change and you can iterate. And a lot of the iteration is really based around this creative process of adaptive connection. So you ask, what is the iterative process of adaptive connection?
Well, but let me stop you right there for just a second. I just want to make
Sure.
sure, just for our listeners here, that you're not saying that things like an IEP or a checklist or rubrics are actually going away.
No, not at all.
Okay.
No. Matter of fact, it could be updating them, or the IEP is your starting point. Because what you did in the meeting back in April then goes to the teacher for September. And the teacher looks at a half a dozen to, depending on the class and the neighborhood, right? And who's there. You can have anywhere from 4 to 8 IEPs in a class. And then the teacher's like,
Right.
I don't even know these kids yet. How am I even going to learn how to apply an IEP to all of these children? And it's a real struggle. And so all of that's important, but we have to think of that as a starting point. And it's also hard to get that into the teacher's daily routine. How do they integrate that into their daily teaching schedule? And unless you have, a hyper superior memory and everything well built, it's really hard to do that. I got to tell you, I did my best and it was a struggle for me in the classroom. And my initial workaround is that I would just first look at, all right, so what are all of the accommodations I have to do that are students have in common? And let's see if I can just do that for everybody, which is, a good shot. But the truth is that some kids need exactly the opposite of the accommodation. So you don't know that until you start working with a child, and it takes some time to change. Even in my work as a private math teacher now, as I do my research and work with you, I get a lot of students who struggle, and they've been through other teachers, and they come to me online, and I get twice exceptional students who have issues with learning and focusing for whatever their needs are. And it's the use of the spiral adaptive lens that takes time to get to know them, and there's no immediate solutions. It's time. Time is one of the important ingredients, and you need to be kind to yourself and respectful of both yourself and the student to allow yourself to not just me get to know the learner, but for the learner to get to know me. And we make this adaptive dyad together. And that's really important.
So before we jump too far ahead, this is great because I'm worried too. As a gifted education teacher, I worry that, and I've actually seen it in real time, how general education teachers really focus on the deficits. They get into the deficit mindset that a student can't do something because they have an IEP, or because they have maybe a behavioral chart, or if there's things like this. So I worry about that too. And like you said, time is probably our most valuable resource. It's unfortunate that in the K-12 system, students can't loop and stay with the same teacher for 2 years
Yes.
because then you have the time to get to know them. Could you tell us more then about the 3 parts of the spiral adaptive lens? Like you've really defined this as starting with curiosity, moving into investigation, and then as a teacher or even as a parent or a manager, then you start like figuring out how do you improvise.
So here's the good news. I didn't make this up. This is what I observed that teachers do naturally. And as I was working on this, I spoke with friends of mine who work in, who are psychologists, who are business people, and are in other professions. And it seems that kind of found what people do organically or naturally. So it's like, or at least when when things are done successfully. And you can look at a lot of problem solving techniques that are out there. There are tons of books on that. But in education and in daily life, we have mostly a basic thing, which is that we see something and we're curious. Gee, I wonder why this is happening. And having that open mind, using the spiral adaptive lens, you're like, well, I see this learner is having an issue. So you go back, either you may have something in your head or you do some quick investigation so you can do something make a proximal solution or in the moment, or you may not be able to solve something at the moment. And you go back and you look it up, you talk to people. And I have a nice example of that where they go and they do their investigation, they come back and they try it. And sometimes things work and sometimes they don't. But it's this iterative process of curiosity, investigation, and improvisation. And then at the end of the improvisation, seeing what works. If it does work, then you get to do it again tomorrow. Now it becomes a part of that P word that we were using, planning. So planning is really important. And you can now think, all right, and you can write into your lesson plan, well, make sure that Bobby or Susie has this to help them through. So
You
let me
actually
go on.
talked about that too. You wrote about, I think it was Gosh, I think it was Teacher Arbor in your writing who
Hmm.
engaged in that moment of curiosity with a student of theirs. Can you tell us a little bit more about Arbor?
Well, Arbor did a few things that were really interesting. Let me say one that was more part of their long-term expertise. One of the things they found over the years is that kids have their own unique, interesting way of being. So what they would do is they would actually, at the beginning of the year, go look at their kids in other classrooms and try to catch them in their natural environment. Who are they? How are they responding? And then set up the classroom so that the classroom already fit the students. So when I was a classroom teacher, one of the things I used to do in order to set up this environment, and this is important what Teacher Arbor did, and I'll give you an example, it's easier to explain it for me, is that I try
Hmm.
to pre-set up adaptations for learners with different physical requirements.
Okay.
And so I would set up a U shape uh, for the students so they were all kind of facing into me, like you would see in a theater. And then in front of the desk, I would allow students to bring in cushions or just sit on the floor. That might be their preferences. And then the row of desks, there's a second row of desks, and those actually became standing desks. And so kids could stand, and for some of them, they like to just stand at the desk. Some of them needed to pace. So they were each able to get to their own physical requirements. You can consider that as being a part of neurotype. Some people need movement, and the more, for example, more ADHD, physical ADHD people are, the more they need to stand and move around in order to think and be comfortable. And some people enjoy sitting and being relaxed, and some people just like to lounge and they don't feel comfortable unless they're lounged out and they can't think. Those kids who sit in front of the TV and get their homework done, parents don't know how. Well, they're doing it because that's their comfortable spot. So Teacher Arbor would then go on to explain with their particular setup that he would check in, and for those students who he wasn't so sure about with their attention, he would, instead of asking them initially, he would take a look over or do his walkabout in the classroom and just look over their shoulder. And while they're looking somewhere else and feeling like they have no attention whatsoever, you could see, well, there's actually work getting done on the desk. There's writing happening. Or for those that aren't, occasionally you'd be like, oh, so what did you think of that? And then the obvious response would be if they heard what was going on, then they were great, or not. So he was actually at a decision point of, do I need to intervene or not? And in this case, in either scenario, we didn't have to intervene, or the actual asking of the question was the intervention. So,
Sometimes just asking a question, yeah, can be the intervention. You're right.
right,
Like just because they feel seen and heard
right.
and recognized.
So in that moment of curiosity, that decision is being made, and there's actually an attempt at a solution, or whether to even try a solution. And from there, the investigation can take time. Very hard, unless you have a lot of things in your head already and you can mull things through and you can think while you're talking to other students. You're probably going to have to go back and do some homework and come back later. So I had another teacher who had a student who was very, very, very uncomfortable and could not sit in their chair, and they
Mm.
were like getting up and going into other kids' desks and grabbing at things. And it turns out that this learner was autistic. And the teacher went home and was thinking about it and said, you know what? I happen to have an autistic child myself. And my mother gave me a weighted teddy bear for my child. So she thought, I'm going to bring this to school and see what happens. So she investigated, she went home, she was like, well, this is not necessarily working for my daughter, but let me see if it works for this student. So she went home, got the weighted stuffed animal, and brought it in. And she very nonchalantly said, hey, you want to hold this? And the student did. And all of a sudden, everything was magically in place. So the child now was able to focus on schoolwork and get work done. And at the end of the activity or the lesson, the teacher asked for it back and said, if you like, next time we have a lesson, if you like that, we can do it again if that's okay with you. And the student was like, yeah, I really liked having it with me. And so it was a positive improvisation. So at this point, the teacher was like, all right, I got something that works. So I don't want to overdo it, but I can use it as a reinforcement to something that they want intrinsically, not something I'm making up, like, giving them extra credits or something, but this really feels good. So they're getting intrinsic reward for it. Um, and then build it into the lesson planning and think, well, when do I use this? And also ask the question, what other students might need this? And so the teacher got a couple more for the classroom. Of course, as a teacher, got it out of her own pocket, but it worked. It made her class better.
I love how you tell the story, though, too. I've heard you tell this story before about this teacher who not only got curious, but was able to investigate. And then the improvisation phase, which was so funny, and I've heard you tell this story before, and I was just going to share it with everybody, was that this teacher brought this the weighted stuffed animal in, and instead of saying this is somehow prescriptive, like, oh,
Hmm.
you have to hold this while you do your work because that's what your IEP says that you have to do. And instead, the teacher improvised in this way and was asking that particular student, hey, could you do me a favor? Right? Could you just hold on to this stuffed animal for me for this period of time? And
Right.
it was during the lesson. And I love how you tell that story because the student was able to sit and be able to focus on the lesson and actually engage in the lesson because they had that weighted stuffed animal on their lap. But instead of coming at this and improvising from this was what I was told, this has to happen. She took this in a different way in her improvisation. It was playful and it was sweet and it
Yeah.
worked.
One of the things that she told me at the end of the interview was that in learning to do this and engage in this process, all of a sudden her job became a lot easier. And that she started to see everybody, and it's interesting, we'll talk about this another time, but she started to see everybody and she corrected herself like they're on a spectrum, but she was making sure to say it's not like an autism spectrum, but that everybody's got something. And
Yeah.
everybody's got some set of traits that require unique support. And that once you look at them and you're able to help them get to that one point, all of a sudden teaching gets easier. And then as the situation arises again, and there's another requirement in the moment, then that becomes supportive for a while. And I want to stay on what you're saying about prescriptive as well, because when you're talking about something that's prescriptive, all of a sudden you're asking teachers to become doctors and use this medical
Yeah.
language and to be medical practitioners. And it's unfortunate. And it's because we have, the requirements of federal law and we look at things through the ADA that we need to show that in order to get extra money and support, you have to show a disability.
Right.
And by doing that, everything gets framed as a disability. And our work comes from an entirely opposite angle. We come from a strengths-based approach, and we come from an ecological neurodiversity approach. The strength-based approach, I want to say about just a paragraph on that, is what it does when you embrace the strength-based approach. It's more than just saying, let me look at their strengths. And it isn't just a Pollyanna way to look at a child.
Okay.
Because that's a misunderstanding about it. It's asking, on one hand, you say, let's look at the strengths first. And it's also saying, if you want to get more academic about it, it's also saying we're in a neurodiverse environment and each child has their own set of strengths. And with that, not everything can be a strength. So if something is not a strength, it doesn't mean that it's a deficit and you need a prescription for it. You need to build from the strengths and help them build extra skills as much as they can within what they're able to do. And for some kids, they can really build those non-strengths up to become strengths, or at least be something that they can work around and be a part of that. And that's part of this process. And this also extends to everything in life, all relationships, just like we were talking before about parenting and teachers and business and actually family relationships, spouses, co-workers, the whole thing. Uh, it really is operating with this positive, affirmative mindset and respecting each other for their strengths, and then knowing that if something is not in their strength category, that we can support them with it, and certainly not hurt them for it as well, and not berate them over it or be prescriptive about it and pedantic. It's all about strengths. And to me, that's what the strength-based approach means.
Thank you, Barry. That's really helpful. That's very, very helpful. I think for a lot of people, when you're coming at this, sometimes you could be a manager, you could be a teacher, but also be a parent and also a sibling or a spouse. And we live in all of these different roles. And so taking that spiral adaptive lens and being able to look at people, adults or children, in different roles and saying, like, let's approach this from a perspective of curiosity
Yeah.
rather than judgment or deficit from the beginning. I think that opens us up a lot.
And that's the magic of it. And all of a sudden, there's a lightness to it
Yeah,
for everybody in the system. You're no longer looking for what's wrong. Oh, I mean, when I was a kid, I remember the hot discussion the other day on our first podcast. You talked about Dr. Spock and that whole mindset from back in the 60s and 70s. And the big expression was, I know what your problem is. Well, my
yeah,
problem is that you think I have a problem. All right. We can go find whatever we want to find, and we can find problems everywhere. But the first thing we're looking for are what's right. And then what can we do to help with what's right? Now, in a business uh, and in a classroom setting, one of the things that Susan Baum does in her classrooms education that I really like is that she does a lot of grouping and
yep,
setting up how do you get kids with different types to support each other based on their strengths. And in school, that seems revolutionary. The idea that you can have, well, if you have a kid who's really good at leadership, they're the ones in charge of the group. If you have another kid who's good at, you know, visual graphics, they're in charge of that. One person may say, well, everybody has to do everything because everybody has to be great at everything. And that's lovely, but it's not real. And when you go in the workplace, what do? We actually have people with titles like analyst, graphic
right,
designer, right?
right, right,
Mathematician, salesperson. I mean, they all have all these jobs because that's what their strength is. We don't ask somebody to
right.
be everything in a company. Why should we ask them to do that in a classroom?
It's
That's
so
maladaptive.
unrealistic. I know.
Right,
It's so unrealistic to ask like a 12-year-old to be, great at everything.
right.
It's unrealistic. I love that example, Barry. I do the same thing in my work at Purdue. On the postdoc, the position I'm working in right now as well, is we have a team of graduate students. And so I approached them. I actually took the spiral adaptation lens. I don't even think I told you this, by the way,
Hmm.
but I approached and I actually talked to each one of our grad students who work on this grant with me. And I asked them what they were interested in, what they felt their best strengths were. So was it qualitative, the qualitative data side? Was it the quantitative data side? Was it creating modules in professional development and recordings and sort of the graphic arts side of things? And I asked them, that might be your strength, but what do you want to learn?
Right.
Where do you feel comfortable? Where do you want to stretch and grow into? And it's funny because every single one of these grad students actually defaulted to their strengths. That was the first place they went to. And they're like, yes, I want to learn the quantitative side. And yes, I'm learning that. But I really feel so drawn. I feel like that's my strength, is maybe working in the qualitative data side. And the funny thing is that just having those short conversations with each grad student, not only is Dr. Olenchek and I, aligning task with talent, but also their interests. And each person, I feel like, is giving more of themselves. And they get to dive deeper into their strengths and really push themselves and challenge themselves too. So it's something I've been applying in my workplace as well. So I don't think I told you that story.
That's a great story. Thank you. And it's funny in business, some of this may not be so outlandish, right? Because
Right.
we think of that, okay, but in education, it's a it's almost a revelation because there's so much pressure
Right.
on teachers to expect everybody to do well across the board. And this whole another conversation for another day, but we stamp children like a piece of meat with a grade from A to D, and they're not. They have their own space to develop. And our jobs as teachers is how well we get them to develop and feel comfortable,
Right.
take chances, and to move from point A to point B, and then from B to C and C to D. And we talked just the other day about the spiral, so I'm taking that into account. But we know that there will be evolution and revolution and all those things going on, but they'll keep oscillating until they get to where they need to go. And it's our job, and that's a part of the spiral adaptive lens, is to see that within the spiral model, kids will oscillate and they'll go up and down and back and forth, and it may seem like they're falling apart, but they're not. They're reintegrating their knowledge. We see that, for
Yep.
researchers out there, we see that with both Piaget and Dabrowski, talking about how that reintegration is so important.
So it sounds like, just at the heart here, that the spiral adaptive lens is a way to understand people who develop in a non-linear and often asynchronous ways, especially
Hmm.
our twice and multi-exceptional learners. It
Hmm.
helps us take a pause before reacting and choose a response that's based on connection, not compliance.
Yes. And I want to make a point too, is that we're starting here and we're talking big picture and foundational issues. And in future podcasts, we'll be breaking these down, and we're going to be interviewing parents, teachers, and others, and to see how they do this and their perspective on it, and how you hear them do their thinking and make things happen. And also, we're going to find other thought leaders who talk about these things in their own way too. So if what we're saying may not fit within your strength right now, that's okay. We're going to find other people to describe this in different ways as well.
So, Barry, thank you so much today for sharing with us your research, your findings, how it applies to all of us, and how we can even start to use the spiral adaptive lens in our everyday lives. Thank you so much for sharing this work with us.
Oh, thanks, Karen. And I look forward to many more of these together, doing these for many years to come.
Me too. Thanks, everybody.
Bye bye.
That wraps up episode 2 of Spiral We Radio. A huge thanks to Dr. Barry Gelston and Dr. Karen Arnstein for breaking down the spiral adaptive lens and showing us how a shift in perspective can open the door to stronger, more adaptive connections. If you found this conversation valuable, please follow, rate, and share the podcast with others who care about neurodiversity and education. Until next time, keep looking through that spiral adaptive lens.